Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to an episode of Tag Along. I am your host, Bilal Khan, and I have here with us Sheikh Suleiman Hani, our latest addition to the AlMaghrib roster in the tradition of Islamic sciences. We have various books of Hadith. Right? And of those Hadith, we have like the what they call the Sahihain,
Yes.
right? Which is the two Sahih, which is Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. Then you have the Sunan, right? The Sunan is Tirmidhi, and Nisa'i, Ibn Majah,
Abu Dawud.
and Abu Dawud.
Tirmidhi is considered Jami'.
Jami', what does that mean?
Jami' Tirmidhi. Jami' is comprehensive.
Okay.
So the nice thing is there's only three that can be given the term Jami'. Tirmidhi is one of them.
Okay.
And the other two are the Sahihain.
Tirmidhi would be just below the Sahihain in terms of ranking,
No, in terms of comprehensiveness.
in terms of comprehensiveness in regards to how many Hadith they have.
Comprehensive in terms of the subjects covered. Just to clarify. As for numbers, yeah, it's a little different.
Interesting.
And in terms of ranking, every scholar you'll find of Hadith with the third, fourth, fifth, sixth book, they'll give different rankings.
Okay. And then you have, because in a previous conversation, and even with other students of knowledge and instructors, they mentioned the 9 books, right?
Yes.
So you have so Tirmidhi, Nisa'i, Abu Dawud, and Nisa'i,
Ibn Majah.
and Ibn Majah.
I actually just did a recent Q&A somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, who can list the 6 books of Hadith in chronological order?
Chronological. That's
I ended up having to remove chronological order.
okay. I got you.
But basically, you have these main 6 books of Hadith. There are many others. There are the 9 books of Hadith. There are other books aside from the 9. And the nice thing about it is,
but then you also have so you have these 6 books of Hadith,
yes,
right? And then you also have Imam Malik's 2 Muwattas,
okay,
right? You got
Imam Malik, one of the most important books that we have.
One of the most, and is it fair to say that there are 2 because one is by his student Yahya bin Yahya, who took it to Spain, and the other one is Imam Muhammad, who has the latest rendition of it before he passed?
So Muwatta Malik is considered one, through whom is what the scholars discuss. So you'll find usually the major books will compile or combine.
Okay. So the other major books are inclusive of Imam Malik's Muwatta?
Like the other 6?
Yeah.
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
No.
But it is so it itself is considered separate from.
It's considered its own book amongst the 9.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's not considered 2 separate books because
it's considered one. Yeah.
Oh, it is considered
Muwatta
one.
Malik, yeah.
Okay. And who? So now we're at 7. What are the other 2?
You have Musnad Ahmad.
Okay,
this
the
came
Musnad
before.
Ahmad.
The Musnad
Okay.
Imam Ahmad, more than 40,000 hadith.
We're talking about Ahmad by
Ahmad bin Hanbal.
Okay, got it.
And then you have Sunan ad-Darimi.
Sunnat ad-Darimi.
Darimi, yes. D-A-R-I-M-I.
D-A-R-I-M-I.
Sunan ad-Darimi.
Okay, and who is that by?
Ad-Darimi.
Oh.
Rahimahullah.
Okay, I got it.
Musnad Ahmad by Imam Ahmad.
Okay, well, yeah, that one.
Muwatta Malik. I'm just kidding.
Now,
by the way, there are many other books
Yeah.
that we use. Ibn Khuzaymah's book of Hadith.
okay.
However, generally speaking, the scholars classify and say the 9 books of Hadith, and more specifically, Al-Kutub al-Sitta, the 6 books of Hadith.
So the 6 are included in the 9.
Yes.
Okay.
Of
And
course.
where would someone like a Tahawi Maqasid,
That would have nothing to do with these.
that would have, but that's more like a.
These are the references for Hadith compilations.
Okay, I got it.
Muwatta Malik obviously came before all of these.
Yeah.
Some of the scholars used to include it with the 6. There was difference of opinion about what the 6 are.
Really?
Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, there's different opinions about the 6 books.
Okay.
Eventually, they added Ibn Majah to it. So the aim of Ibn Majah was not necessarily a sahih, was not just only authentic.
But that's not the case with either Abu Dawud or.
Right, but Ibn Majah had more, according to some scholars, had more weaknesses than the others.
Okay, got it. So you have.
That's why some didn't even want to include it with the 6. But now it's known that these are the 6 books of Hadith.
There's a lot of books, and I'm guessing that you've gone through all 9.
Alhamdulillah, I have.
Okay.
Of course, I had some instructors teach multiple books.
Uh huh.
Some books taught multiple times by different instructors.
Multiple explanations of.
Well, no, it's not necessarily just explanations.
Okay.
So with each one, it was a different experience.
Sure.
With Sunan ad-Darimi, for example, which is the least one that I studied amongst these, it was Ijazat Sama'.
Okay.
So ijazah of listening to every single hadith.
Okay.
With Tirmidhi, for example, sharh,
Yeah.
in-depth sharh, especially of Kitab al-Fitan. With Muslims, several different teachers.
Are any of these books, do they have like their own unique books within it that others don't?
Yeah, almost all of them do.
Really?
As in chapters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Has anyone ever like taken all their works and compiled it into one super mega compilation?
Yeah, I'm sure it was attempted before, but physically it's useless. Online, that's already the case where if you go somewhere, you can just click on each one.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But physically, it just didn't make sense to compile 9 books of hadith into
one major Bible.
Exactly. You just buy all 9 sets.
Okay.
Right. Some scholars have proposed coming up with a compilation of all authentic hadith that we have into one book and referencing them with numbers so that basically there's a standard for the future, digitally speaking.
Right.
Which would be a great idea and it would help a lot.
So the idea that you have this Sahih Hadith and it's like this Sahih Hadith is compiled in all of these books.
Right.
Right. And then the ranking would be based on who's compiled. Like these are like the golden Sahih where or like the platinum Sahih.
Platinum.
Yeah.
Wow,
so,
you just came up with a new hadith classification, bro.
So it's like platinum.
Hadith is not Sahih, it's platinum.
Yes, platinum Sahih because it's in all 9 books.
Well, no, the idea was to gather all of the hadith.
Yeah.
All of them and give them numbers and basically set a standard for the future so that references across the world, theses, biographies, websites, whatever it may be, everybody will have one standard.
But nobody's done that because these are all easily accessible.
They're easily accessible and nobody's done the work because it's a lot of work.
I would
It
imagine.
would require a group of scholars.
It's not a one-man show.
It's not a one-man show.
Okay, and just to kind of give an idea, we're talking about within each book several thousand.
Each one is different. Yeah, the average for the first 6 that we mentioned, most of them are around 5. If I had to give an average of every single one, it's probably around 5,000.
5,000.
Yeah, but Musnad Ahmad's 40-something thousand.
No way.
Yeah, Musnad Ahmad's
40,000 hadith.
Yeah, he memorized 1,000,000, rahimahullah. Imam Ahmad was known to be
from a perspective of an Orientalist, I was like,
You're skeptical.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I can see that.
Like, come on, for real? Are you serious?
That's Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah. That's why he was who he was.
Because here's the thing.
But remember, when we say 1,000,000 hadith
if you were to write 1 to 1,000,000 on a piece, not a piece of paper, but several sheets of paper, it would take you 63 years to do so.
Well, here's why it's 1,000,000. Because you can have one hadith through 50 different chains.
Okay.
Variations of a hadith.
So it's not that he has 1,000,000 hadith. He has over 1,000,000 links.
Well, technically, it's a hadith because it has a different chain of transmission.
Okay.
Or different wording.
Okay.
Different sahabi. So sometimes you can have one hadith 50, 60 times.
Okay.
Right? Now, again, this is all hadith that he memorized, not put in his musnad. Why? Because a lot of them, the objective of the scholars of hadith was to remove the fabrications.
Okay.
All right, so they always had way more hadith than they ended up realizing and studying, critiquing were actually authentic.
Okay.
Right, so he ended up with 40-something thousand. Of course, they're not all authentic. Many are weak.
Right.
The objective was not only Sahih hadith.
But for him to, it was to compile
it was a compilation of everything.
I see. Okay, understand. That makes more sense.
He had or compiled 600,000.
Okay.
His Sahih has, less than 10,000.
Right. Okay. Understood. Especially for people who start delving into the subject. What is the difference between hadith and sunnah?
It is a common question, especially when you first dive into hadith studies. So Bilal came up with an excellent question, mashallah. 1 point for Bilal.
Boom.
Some scholars, you can add a sound effect later.
Or I should do it here. Bing. There we go. You see 1 point.
Mashallah. Some scholars basically believe they were synonymous, right?
Okay.
So it's the same thing. Others said sunnah, or when you take the word sunnah, depending on the context, usually they say it includes the rulings that are derived from the hadith.
Now, I would understand that the understanding of the definition of both hadith and sunnah is different based on the discipline of the Islamic science.
Exactly. That's the point. So you have, for example, in usul, and you have in fiqh in general. For example, a ruling on something that is sunnah means is voluntary.
So just I would understand I understand there's really 3 major sciences on this subject, right? You have usul, hadith, and fiqh.
Yes.
Right? And each one has a different definition for each?
Yes.
Okay. So now
for sunnah.
Okay, for sunnah.
Right.
So tell me what's the difference between each?
Okay, so you can have, for example, the understanding of a ruling.
Okay.
And only a ruling.
Yeah.
Right? So what is the ruling on me picking up my phone and dropping it?
Okay.
Right? It's not sunnah, right? But in case it was, I would say the ruling on this sunnah. There's only 5 possible rulings.
Okay.
Right?
Well, the thing is, it would be sunnah to not drop it if you have the Quran open up as an app.
That's a great question, Bilal. We should ask the scholars. That's 2 points for Bilal. Bilal's on roll, mashallah. So, for example, something could be haram, right? For example, 2 rakahs before Fajr, what is the ruling? Is it wajib? Is it fard?
It's recommended.
It's mustahab, or sometimes they'll use the word sunnah.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
It's voluntary.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you have within You have within
so
understanding.
in a fiqh context, when something is recommended, it's mustahab. They'll say that it is sunnah.
Yes.
Okay, and that's what they mean by it.
Sunnah is voluntary, right? It's not obligatory. They're trying to distinguish. It's not obligatory, but it's very rewarding.
So when somebody's saying, "Oh, that's sunnah," the better question would be to ask, "Are you asking in the context of fiqh,
only you would
hadith?"
What kind of sunnah do you actually mean?
Yeah.
Only you would do that, Bilal. Pray the 2 rak'ahs as sunnah before Fajr. What sunnah are you referring to? What other sunnah is there?
And how do you know I didn't already pray it yesterday?
Wow. All right, take a point off from that. You lost a point for that. So yeah, sunnah could be the ruling. It could be synonymous in hadith with everything about the Prophet ﷺ, right?
Yeah.
So the sunnah, like we say, the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ.
Yeah.
We're referring to many things at once.
Sure.
Not just hadith.
Okay.
Right? And then you have the extracted ruling, the hukum.
Okay.
So you can't say a hadith is a hukum. Like you can't say this hadith is the ruling. No, the hadith is the content.
Yeah.
You take from it the ruling.
Right. So you make a law policy based on that. Okay, got
based
it.
on that. And then those are basically the differences. So it seems if you take all of this into consideration.
But the hukam is contextual to a time and place according to the authority of the one who has pulled it.
Right, that's a different matter though.
Okay.
All right, let's not get on a tangent. You're right. That's a different matter though.
Sure.
So basically the difference between sunnah and hadith, according to all of these different views and opinions and disciplines, you can say that hadith is specific to that content, like the hadith you're talking about, the narration.
Yeah.
Whereas sunnah could mean the ruling, it could mean the extracted hukum, like the legal ruling.
Okay.
And it could mean everything about the Prophet ﷺ's life, his seerah, the Sahaba as well.
So even now we're taking this definition of sunnah into the science of hadith that is connected to seerah, or is that not a science of hadith? But
it's not about seerah. It's just when we say everything related to the Prophet ﷺ's life.
Yeah. Right.
You hear the word seerah often. You hear sunnah often. But seerah is more specific in that it's the biography of the Prophet ﷺ as well.
Sure.
So sunnah could include the companions interacting with one another and talking about the Prophet ﷺ. For example, when you say follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, what does that really mean? Lifestyle? Does it mean the specific ruling? You know what I mean? So sunnah is more general, hadith is more specific.
Okay.
You're a fitness guy,
so
you would probably say health and fitness.
Okay. Sure.
Right?
And what's interesting is even the understanding and idea, because actually within the fitness industry, one of the things that I admire CrossFit for is the fact that they were the first ones within the industry to actually empirically define what fitness means. And fitness is an individual's ability to do work, which is measured in power and wattage, which is defined by force times distance divided by time. And so
I didn't know they did that.
Yeah, no, that's what.
Wow.
And that's why when Reebok bought CrossFit and then publicized the International CrossFit Games, somebody could be given the title the fittest man or fittest woman on earth. Empirically.
Wow.
Yes. And that's nobody else can have that claim because unless they are playing by the rules of the definition of what fitness is.
Interesting.
And they are the ones who also did, because now you can empirically define fitness on an X and Y graph. You can add a Z angle to it to make it a three-dimensional graph, and your fitness over an extended period of time, now that three-dimensional space becomes your overall health over time.
That's interesting.
Just like how, and this is where they use weather and climate. Your weather, which is a two-dimensional graph, over time becomes a climate of the region. Hadith is to sunnah as fitness is to health.
I'm not saying anything, but okay.
Okay. You're the one who brought it up.
I said you're a fitness guy, right? We took it from there. It's the understanding that basically sunnah is more general.
Okay.
Right? It could include more than just hadith.
It's inclusive of hadith.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Now there's various types of hadith, right? You have classification of hadith. Well, one, what is it? It's the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, right?
It could be the saying of the Prophet ﷺ. Could be the behavior of the Prophet ﷺ.
So somebody observing what he did.
Right.
Okay.
It could be the tacit approval or disapproval of something.
Okay. So what do you prove?
For example, you do something in front of him, the Prophet ﷺ, he doesn't disapprove.
Okay.
The scholars took this to mean something good, meaning it's not prohibited.
Okay, so the behavior is also inclusive of what he also didn't do.
Right.
Okay.
Action or inaction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Action, inaction, approval, disapproval,
right.
Statement.
Yes.
Anything else?
That's the general definition.
Okay, that's the general definition. Okay. And having said that, then, if we know what a hadith is, so it's inappropriate to say the sayings of the prophets because that's limiting.
It is limiting. Yes, in English language, it is limiting.
So if anybody want to ever say not only just the saying, but the sayings, the approvals, the disapprovals, the actions and inactions.
Sometimes they even ask, is the physical description part of the hadith or part of the sunnah? You know, the Shama'il al-Tirmidhi?
Right.
The physical description of the Prophet ﷺ, what is that considered? Because it's the Sahaba describing the Prophet ﷺ. So the scholars had different opinions about what this
is that hadith or not?
Yes. So they disputed, what does this really fall under?
Well, the way that he looks could also be an example of how he dressed, and you can derive ruling from that, can you not?
Yes, but the hadith that the sayings that explicitly describe the Prophet ﷺ without anything else, without any behavior or anything else, there's a difference of opinion about what it falls under. So you have many of them, for example, saying this is a description of the Prophet ﷺ. It's considered part of the sunnah, but not necessarily a hadith in that you can use this for, like a ruling or something.
Okay.
Some of them. So these are the various views about hadith.
So now, in hadith itself, and I'm looking at it like from a historical perspective, during the time of the Umayyads and the fall of the Umayyad Empire and the rise of the Abbasids, at that time you had the political Shia and you had the as well as the Abbasids, all vying for power. And one of the things that they would do to justify their position in place is that they would attribute statements to the Prophet ﷺ justifying their position, right? Absolutely. And this was done on all sides. And when the Abbasids came to power, to justify how they came to power, which was in a very brutal way, historically speaking, to justify their position in power, they continued. Basically, it was a government propaganda machine designed to continue to. They had sponsored people to, hey, you need to make sure that we're in power, and you have, as I understood, scholars across the Muslim world, so to speak, at the time, who are trying to also, I guess, collect these and be like, okay, you know what? I don't think the Prophet ﷺ said this. And if he did, amongst them, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the second Khalifa, the second major ruler of the Abbasids, had even requested or tried to commission Imam Malik to write a book of law that the Abbasids could use as the standard law. And he said, in my own understanding of the dialogue that took place, he's like, nah, yo, I'm going to do this for myself. Not for you.
MashaAllah. 21st century translation.
And so what then resulted in his masterpiece, which is the Muwatta of Imam Malik, which I guess in of itself is a first generation setup of the sciences of hadith. At least as I understood it, what gave birth to the science that has continued to develop and evolve over time because of what people have attributed to the Prophet ﷺ in regards to his sayings, actions, inactions, approvals, and disapprovals.
So you brought up a lot of different points. One of the points that comes up is, when did the fabrication of hadith begin? Right? Because we know there's such thing as fabricated hadith, right. Obviously. With the scholars, their job was to remove and filter out any fabrications from the Muslim Ummah, because this is about the Prophet ﷺ. Right. It's something sacred. Yeah. Right. So a system had to start being developed quickly. Yeah. In the beginning, right, for example, there are scrolls, there are writings, compilations, usually from one Sahabi. For example, let's say your companion, somebody comes to you and takes notes from you. And every hadith you're relaying directly from the Prophet ﷺ, let's say Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, they're writing them down, right? So many of them are written, memorized, passed on to other people, spread around the Ummah in many different ways. For example, Al-Bukhari reports in one of his books, I believe it's Tarikh al-Kabir, he said Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu taught more than 800 different tabi'een the narrations that he heard from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. That's a huge number. Yeah. You can imagine with 800 people, so like we always do this activity in classes. I love this activity. You have 5 people, go to as many people in a large audience, a large crowd, and share it. And if you hear something from any of these 5, you can go ahead and share it if you want as well. Yeah. The idea is it spreads very quickly. Right, it becomes mass corroboration very quickly. Yeah. The most mass corroborated hadith, for example, or the first one that's usually referenced in order, is whoever attributes something to me, let him take his place in the hellfire. Okay. Right. Whoever falsely attributes something to the Prophet ﷺ, then you take your place in the hellfire. Okay. Right. In Arabic, it's like don't lie basically against the Prophet ﷺ. Otherwise, it's a major sin. This is our understanding. So the idea that somebody were to say, "Hey, you know what? This fruit is mentioned in the prophetic sayings when it's not." So you raise a good point. What I was going to say was, with fabrications of hadith, there are different causes and also different times. Most of the scholars say the initial first basically knowledge of any or report of any fabricated hadith was during the turmoil around the time of Ali radiallahu anhu. Right. And all of the fitna that took place in the third and fourth during the time of Uthman, during the time of Ali, and afterwards started to increase with people giving falsely attributed hadith to honor Ali radiallahu anhu more, or to honor Muawiyah more, and this happened as well. But then there are many other causes. Politics is a huge thing, right?
Like politics and economics,
economics. So one guy, for example, he's known as he fabricated a hadith that said that the Prophet supposedly said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whoever eats harissa, it's like good for your spine, like harissa, the dessert. Right. So they found out this guy used to sell harissa. Right. This guy was basically, here's a hadith. Oh yeah, I also sell some if you want some for your spine. Right. So there are many different causes, many different reasons, but fabricated hadith started spreading more and more due to the politics more than anything else. You had groups emerging, people coming up and fighting, and it's very sad. But the good thing is, it caused the scholars to start deriving methodologies, systems of checks
to filter through,
and also start documenting who is who. Who is this guy that's saying this hadith?
Right.
Fabricated hadith. Where did you hear it from? If you don't know, it's not a.
The idea of fact checking came into play.
Huge. And it's very important. So all the disciplines of hadith and the methodology started emerging, even basically at the end of the 1st and 2nd centuries. Most of the work was done because
1st and 2nd Hijri, if you guys are wondering, that's about 7th and 8th century Gregorian.
It would have to be Hijri, right? Otherwise, we got a problem. Time of Prophet Isa. So basically, they developed more and more. You have compilations being spread more and taught more. The Muwatta of Malik was one of the first famous ones. There are many others. So when the system started increasing and improving and becoming similar across the scholars, you had basically a way to always filter out that which is fabricated. Right. So it became very consistent. It was preserved in a very wise way. For example, if you say, I heard from Suleiman, I heard from someone who heard from Suleiman, right? And you don't know who that someone is. If I hear this from you, I'm going to say, we can't take a hadith from an unknown person. There's no such thing as anonymous here.
But at the same time, you could be like, well, I did say that, but I don't know who that is.
Right, no. So what I meant was, if you heard from someone who heard from someone else, right? And I'm coming to hear the hadith from you to collect it. You're like, but who's the guy in the middle?
Okay.
Right? The chain is extremely important. And this is one example. This is somebody who is majhul.
So if I'm relaying something and I don't know anything about the person who I got it from, then you discount what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, it's not because of you, but it's because we don't know who that is.
Right.
It's majhul, unknown person. So we leave it.
Gotcha.
They reference them, but they're not authentic. You can't have an authentic hadith unless it is musnad.
It's interesting. You talk about even just corroboration and things like that. It almost sounds similar to how a police officer does a accident report. Right. I just remember one time I was in LA, got into a car accident. The person was making a left turn. I was going straight. Collision took place. Then police officer comes in and doing the accident report. In the accident report, it states all the different people that the police officer has spoken with that were witnesses on that intersection, and one of the people had said that I crossed a red light.
Wow.
Right, and the person was making a left turn because they were in the box, and I passed the light. However, everybody else said the light was green for me. And so the police officer himself said, based on the testimonies of other people, discounting this person who said that the light was red.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of like that.
Yeah, that absolutely happens. So there's two things that they look at, two primary things. The first is accuracy, like the memory, dabt, and then the second is the trustworthiness, the character. If you don't have character, it doesn't matter how accurate you are.
Right.
Whereas if you have character, but you might have slight problems with memory, then they'll compare that to all the other, basically testimonies of other people and see, is it the same? And how many times is it the same? How many times has your accuracy been off? And then there's some people who have complete terrible accuracy. Right. So they eventually stop accepting from them. Or it becomes weak, is what I'm saying. Right. So if we're talking about sahih, it has to be both upright in character and it has to be accurate person. Otherwise, it's not sahih.
Got it. Okay. From what I know and understand, there's the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu, and then there's hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu, not about him, but things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. And then there's things from the companions that they said, or opinions that they held, but is not necessarily connected to Rasulullah sallallahu. Are these all the same?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So you have hadith nabawi,
Okay.
Right? The Prophet ﷺ saying.
Okay.
Hadith Qudsi.
Okay.
The sayings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Qudsi meaning like qadasa, pure, holy.
Pure, yeah.
Okay.
Through the Prophet ﷺ.
So is it fair to assume that there are sahih and da'if and mamdu for Qudsi?
So with Hadith Qudsi, so this is one of the primary differences between Hadith Qudsi, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words, and the Quran. The Quran is verbatim preserved, whereas Hadith Qudsi is in meaning. The second is that because it's a hadith preserved by people and passed on orally like any other prophetic saying, right, or prophetic narration, therefore there are some that are sahih and then there are some that are fabricated and weak and hasan and so on and so forth.
Now when you say verbatim, are there a hadith of Rasulullah that are verbatim of him?
We believe that the hadith in general, the hadith literature is preserved in meaning. However, when you have a hadith that is mutawatir, mass corroborated, mass transmitted, you'll find that it's almost always identical in wording, but they're not expected to be.
So it's not even appropriate to say that these are the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ. These are the meanings of the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's new to me. And so similarly, we cannot say that there are any hadith Qudsi that are verbatim of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Rasulullah.
Well, no, that's where there's a difference of opinion about are they preserved word for word?
Okay.
And if so, how do we reconcile between the different variations?
Okay.
Right. Even with what you just brought up about the hadith, we can't say that they are sayings. But if somebody is upright and they are accurate and this is what they heard, is this not what the Prophet said?
They're still essentially interpreting what. Because and again, the only thing that I know of in popular culture and context is like in the case of like a police doing an investigation or detective, right?
Right.
Where something happened and they're getting the eyewitness reports of what's taking place, of what's happening. People will give the interpretation of what they witnessed and saw and heard.
That, yes, but what about, so here's the difference with hadith, especially if they're saying I heard the Prophet ﷺ say,
like
right,
hadith Jibreel,
right, like hadith Jibreel, right? There's some variations between the report from Suleiman and the report from Abu Hurairah. So you'll have slight variations depending on who heard it and what they're reporting.
And even in that variation, we understand that that's not exactly what Rasulullah said. This is what he said according to this person versus
what Abu Hurairah reported that he said.
Okay.
Right.
Got it. Okay. So therefore, it is fair to say that it is, again, the interpreted meaning of...
I don't want to say interpreted because the interpretation is different. This is what Abu Hurairah said he heard.
Okay.
Right? So
but it's not verbatim to what Umar bin Khattab heard.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And so the scholars always try to reconcile if there's a major difference. Usually it's not... So it depends on the hadith, but usually, like with this example, they'll try to reconcile the differences and see if there is a problem, like any kind of conflict, how do you reconcile?
Okay.
Right?
But there's no conflict, but just differences in wording and expression.
But again, it's not Abu Hurairah saying, I think, he meant this and this. So it's not really interpretation. Rather, it's I heard him say such and such and such.
Okay.
Yeah. And
are there any hadith where the Sahabi says, well, I think he meant this?
Yeah, many.
Okay.
So many hadith will have the disclaimer at the end where it says like the narrator, think that he meant this or he think that he also said this.
Okay.
Others will say, I think he added on to it something else.
Would a classic example of that be when the companions were going on a battle mission and Rasulullah told them don't... Yeah.
No, that's a little different. That's their understanding of the instruction itself.
Okay.
So that was their understanding of should we pray when we get there or should we pray when we get there only if we get there before.
So there's a difference in the application of the command, not necessarily what he said.
Yeah, so that was different because they were there, they heard the command, they moved on. We're talking about here the hadith compilation after the fact.
Okay, got it.
Right. And then, so that's hadith Qudsi,
yeah,
right? Sayings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, you cannot recite it in salah.
Okay.
But you can recite Quran. I hope you're not reciting Salah Bilal. Are you? And then you have...
I think it would be impressive on its own for someone to be able to recite Hadith Qudsi.
Because that means they memorize it, right?
Yeah,
and
right?
Most people are not... Okay.
But here's the thing. Like the Hadith regarding Surah Al-Fatiha and how it is a conversation between the believer and his creator is a Hadith Qudsi.
Okay.
Right? You still recite
You still can't recite in Salah.
You can't recite the Hadith, but you can recite Fatiha, right?
That's great. I hope you have to recite Fatiha. Bilal. And then Hadith Qudsi also, with the Quran, you have some scholars who hold the opinion that you need wudu to touch the Mus'haf, right?
Okay.
Some scholars. And that's the vast majority. And then you have with Hadith Qudsi no such requirement.
Sure.
Right, a book of Hadith Qudsi. With the Quran, you have 6,236 verses. With Hadith Qudsi, authentic ones, I think it's between 100 and 150 authentic ones. Allah. That's the general difference. So Hadith Qudsi, Hadith Nabawi, and then you asked the third thing was Athar, right?
Athar. Or Athar or Athar?
You can use both.
Is there a difference in meaning?
That's a great question. We should ask a linguist. I don't know.
Oh, because I would assuming Athar is singular, Athar is plural.
There you go.
I'm just assuming.
If that's correct, 2 points for Bilal. You lost your other point earlier.
Well, take one step back and 2 steps forward.
There's also ruins.
Ruins?
Ruins. In Arabic, that's I think that's Athar, right?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Allahu Alam. I guess we'll double check after.
Oh boy. Okay.
So you have the sayings of the Sahaba. This is what some scholars said Athar are, or Athar. An Athar is a saying of the Sahabi.
Okay.
It's not necessarily a hadith. For example, Ibn Abbas said such and such and such, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the general understanding. Again, there are differences depending on the scholar between Athar and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, Hadith Nabawi, and then the Hadith Qudsi.
Okay.
Right. And then we talked about Sunnah. It's more general.
Sure. Yeah. Is there a difference between the statements of the companions versus the tabi'in?
Yeah. So some of the scholars, I don't even know how you brought that up or thought about that.
Just logical progression, right?
MashaAllah. Well, how far are you going to go?
Companions and then...
How far though?
Well, my next logical question was, what about those people? I'm sure there's a different classification of them who were Muslim at the time of Rasulullah ﷺ, never met him, and died upon that faith, but they had their own statements regarding whatever Islamic stuff.
Oh, that's a great point. So if somebody narrates something before meeting the Prophet ﷺ, first there's the classification. Is this person considered, is the word Sahabi?
Right.
Is the definition that you have to...
Right, and as I understand, they're not a Sahabi.
Right, so the word Sahabi, they would say, has to have met the Prophet ﷺ before he died. And you had to have been Muslim.
Yeah.
Because some met him, they were non-Muslims, the Prophet ﷺ died, then they became Muslim.
Right.
As for their statements, if they were Muslim at the time, how would they have heard the Prophet ﷺ?
So, for example, the couple people come to mind, right? So, amongst them is, say, like Waraqa bin Nawfal. Okay, this man, he essentially believed in the Prophet ﷺ before he had the revelation.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you have narrations of several people. Among them, there was this one person in Yemen.
Waraqa's in Jannah. We know that for sure. There's a hadith that mentions that Waraqa is
right. That's why I'm saying he's a believer, right? Because of that statement of Rasulullah and understanding of his place.
Right.
So, like, the question is, what's he called and what's his statements considered? And at the same time, the people, like, there was this one person in Yemen where Rasulullah said, if you ever meet him, you ask him to make dua for you.
Uwais al-Qarni.
So
he's not a companion.
He's not a companion. Okay. Well, what is he classified as? A tabi'in?
Depending on his era.
Because he lived
at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That's a great question. I don't know.
Okay.
Because the tabi'in are the successors.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Uwais al-Qarni.
But is there, like, are there statements in a different kind? They're not in the books of Hadith.
Like from Uwais al-Qarni or something?
Yeah.
No, they wouldn't be in the books of Hadith.
Nor would, say, Waraqa bin Nawfal. And the people
unless it was in a hadith, like the statement of Khadija
right,
when she took the Prophet to Waraqa.
Yes.
But generally, his statements, no.
Okay. Got it. But that would be inclusive within the understanding of what is seerah.
Yes.
Okay. And seerah is its own science?
Seerah is its own entire field.
Okay. Like in the past, right? It was always understood that you studied at least a few disciplines.
Right. Absolutely.
And so amongst them, from what I know of, right, you've got usul, you've got fiqh, you've got hadith, you've got seerah, you got sharia, which I think...
No, sharia, well, usually the college of sharia covers
much
most
these
of
things,
It's
right?
a comprehensive approach.
Okay. Then you have...
How about aqidah?
Theology, right? Aqidah. And then you also have Quranic sciences.
Ulum al-Quran.
Yeah, and within that you have
Tafsir.
Multiple sciences, tafsir, and
even within
tajweed.
All the other ones, there's multiple fields.
Like within specializations hadith. Within each one, right?
Yeah.
But I guess then what are the general sciences? Sirah, fiqh, hadith, usul.
What do you mean by general, though?
I don't know. Like I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, sure, that's great. So for example, if somebody goes to a Islamic university to study, and they enter the college of, let's say, Quran, like Muhammad Mani, right? So the focus there obviously is more on the disciplines within the Quran.
Right.
Whereas if you go into college of Sharia, it's more comprehensive. You have different things.
What college of Da'wah?
There's college of Da'wah,
Yeah, so like what kind of disciplines would you study in that?
I didn't attend, so I have no idea.
Okay.
It's probably more comparative religions, I'm assuming.
Okay.
If you're referring to the same Jama I'm referring to, it's probably more.
I don't know. Like, I didn't attend any of these universities, so I really like. I'm pulling.
So oftentimes in dawah, they're talking about contemporary issues. There's a lot of fiqh because fiqh is important in dawah.
Sure.
There's comparative religions.
Okay.
So there's aqidah basically.
Okay.
And there's probably a little bit of everything in terms of the basic knowledge that you need for yourself. Right, but as for specialization, it's on outreach, dawah. Probably there's seerah as well, lessons from the seerah. So yeah, you have, like you said, you have seerah, you have fiqh, you have aqidah, you have ulum al-Quran.
Sure.
You have hadith, very important. All of these deserve their own, at least the basics of everything, right?
Sure.
Unless you're going to specialize in something.
One of the things that I was wondering about also is we're talking about like these categories of hadith. Is that how do we know that like these are preserved?
Hadith or the categories? Hadith are preserved?
Yeah.
That's a great question. You probably know right now there's a huge, I don't want to say huge, there is a trend of people who fall into the trap of, let's say, Western Orientalist accusations from the last 200 years.
Okay.
So they're fairly new.
So it's not new. I mean, it's 2 centuries old.
Yeah, but in terms of academic focus on Islam, it's kind of new.
Okay.
Anyways, the whole issue is what they are trying to discredit the entire hadith literature.
Okay. I mean, one thing I've come to understand is like a lot of times they'll attack many narrators, like Aisha radiallahu anha or Abu Huraira specifically. If they discredit one, then that kind of like there's a lot
2,000 hadith.
Right. Exactly. And Imam Muslim's book itself has like what 3,000 something.
Yeah, 3,033. So you have basically a different. The focus from a lot of these Orientalists was, it used to be Quran, right?
Yeah.
They've done so much work about the Quran, and it'll continue to be regurgitated.
Sure.
Now the focus shifted on Hadith because they started realizing, you know what, Muslims depend on Hadith and they care about it as much as they care about the Quran in terms of understanding the religion, right? Not in terms of priority.
Right.
So their focus shifted. They started trying to discredit all Hadith. Some of them tried to do a revisionist approach.
No, one question is like, okay, it's one idea to discredit it, or attempt to discredit it, which comes with a malicious intent. Okay, maybe there is a malicious. I don't know.
But that's how it is for many of them.
But then there's the other idea that instead, as I understand, from a I guess purist, critical Orientalist approach, where it's like let's be critical of like what this is and where it's from, and I mean this goes back to like the understanding that some discussions I've had with certain people where like, oh, the Prophet Muhammad, they would say whatever, right? I'm like, okay, hold on, let's take a step back, right? Can we agree that can we agree that somebody named Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, in Arabia existed? Like, yeah, we can agree that he existed. Okay, great. Can we agree that he claimed prophethood? Yes, we can agree that he claimed prophethood. Okay, now, with this reality, he's either a prophet or he's not, right? If he's not a prophet, then what is he, right? Well, then we go the logical progress, the idea of like, okay, maybe he's a liar. Okay, well, what would he get out of lying? What's the motivation for lying, right? Or maybe he's a magician, maybe he's this, maybe he's that, maybe he's whatever. At the end of the day, when it comes down to it, is like, and this is where the intellectual dialogue comes into play, is like, okay, if he's this, then why did he do that, right? And now many times people are like, then they just start pulling things out of their own opinions of like, well, maybe that's what it is, but there's no basis for that opinion. It's just their own thought. But then the question that comes into play is like, okay, well, maybe he's a politician, right? And he's just a really good politician who attempted to do a lot of good through the claim of prophethood. But then, like all politicians, they do lie. And so I'm like, okay, so you're going back to the fact that he's a liar. But then why do that? Now, one is you can either discredit all these other claims of not prophethood and then look at the reality of the possible reality is maybe he is a prophet. And then look at it from that and the motivations behind it. And the different sacrifices that have been made and the actions that he's taken that are in line with prophethood. So like that, as I understand it, is looking at all these possibilities and the motivations, reasons behind each possibility that would make it for maybe a real critical approach to his prophethood, and then everything that stems from that, which is all the hadith and the Quran and things like that.
Right. Well,
but what you're describing
there's
here,
two different things here. You're talking about starting at you're talking about the prophethood, right?
Yes.
That's the first issue, and that's a whole different issue.
Okay.
And then there's that question of, and the issue of prophethood, a lot of it was addressed by Orientalists when they spoke about the Quran.
Okay.
Because they're claiming he's the author of the Quran.
Okay.
Or he took the Quran.
But I mean, then, and this maybe this is not the scope of this discussion here, but like the idea is like, well, it was historically understood, like the people of his time, he could neither he's unlettered.
Right. So that is a different discussion. The
Yeah.
focus here, when you say, or when I say hadith preservation, was about the hadith, the actual sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, were they preserved or not?
Okay.
Right? Because what are some of the accusations? So everything starts after the death of Rasulullah ﷺ.
Sure.
They ask, was there anything at the time after he died in which they had written anything? Were there writings of hadith? This is the first question.
I mean,
And,
the answer would be yes.
yeah, there are. There are over a dozen different sources and resources proving this. The second is, was there why is the system of isnad to be trusted?
Okay.
What's so good about it, and how do we know that
By
this
isnad, we're talking about
the chain of transmission?
Chain of transmission and testimony.
Yeah, you heard from Suleiman, and I heard, and I say that I heard such and such from Umar. He heard from such and such something. Right. So the chain is important.
Which is similar to the chain of custody that takes place in a court case for evidences that are being used, whether it be chain of custody of physical evidence versus intellectual evidence.
Okay.
Right?
That's interesting.
Because going from one person to the next, they look at, okay, how was this evidence handled? Whom was it handled by? Was there any possibility in the transmission of that evidence from one person to the next for there to be potential tampering of it? If there was, let's throw this evidence out from this court case.
Absolutely.
Similarly, in terms of the testimony of an individual,
right.
Who was this person? What is their credibility? Is there any possibility of the accuracy of their testimony and memory being faulty, and so on and so forth? And they basically add on that to basically have them and their testimony thrown out as well.
Right.
And if it is accepted, then one need to accept all of it.
Right. All of it as in the system.
But
yes,
isn't that the system of isnad on a local scale? Isnad accepted is just scaled up.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay.
There obviously it comes with many other things. Like within the study of hadith, you have at least 10 other studies.
Sure.
Right. So, for example, you have al-Rijal that focus on the individuals.
Okay.
Right? They focus on who is Bilal, everything about
the
Bilal.
Background checks.
It's the full background check.
Okay.
You have another discipline that focuses on conflict, apparent conflict in hadith. Right? So, if this hadith, if you said...
So, reconciling different testimonies of two people who are credible.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there's a whole study, and
sure.
every one of those studies has its own study.
So, basically reconciling between different eyewitness testimonies.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then you have... the study of where people even came from.
Sure.
So aside from the background check, where do you hail from? Could you have possibly met Suleiman? Did you live in the same time?
Okay.
Could you have met?
Okay.
Right, because traveling back then is a big deal.
Right.
Right now it's different. Somebody says I was, in Boston.
So
you couldn't have been in Boston.
It's the reverse motivation behind an alibi. Typically, people seek alibi to get out of being accused of a crime.
Right.
Here they're seeking...
There's one person, Imam Bukhari, and his teacher. They are trying to prove as well that they didn't just live at the same time. I want to know that they met.
Okay.
Which is very difficult.
And in the process of having met, could they have conversed and engaged and discussed and shared intellectual...
Right, as in met for the sake of having heard that one
hadith. For the transmission.
Right.
For that link to have been created.
Could they have met for him to have heard that hadith?
Okay.
Imam Bukhari stipulated this. Imam Muslim strayed away from this. He said, I don't think this strict condition is required. I think, generally speaking, if I and you are both trustworthy, and I say I heard from you, and you live in the same time, then I believe that I met you.
And this is why you can't necessarily combine the books of hadith.
They have different approaches.
Because they're different approaches.
Absolutely. So that's why with hadith, they say, for example, after Imam Bukhari passes away...
So there's a different methodology in this work.
Absolutely. And when someone studies a methodology, they start to appreciate it more.
Okay.
Obviously, there's no one who had as strict of methodology as Imam Bukhari.
Okay.
And this is one of the main points.
I see.
But again, you look at all of the hadith, you see some hadith by later scholars, they'll say this is sahih according to the conditions of Imam al-Bukhari.
Okay.
But he just didn't compile it for one reason or another.
Gotcha.
But it fulfilled his conditions, or Imam Muslim, or both of them.
Okay.
So yeah, they generally had very similar things because he was his student, Imam Muslim. So again, many disciplines within hadith, right? You're trying to make sure there are no fabrications entering this ummah. The scholars are trying to prevent anything false from coming in. And we trust the scholars.
So the Orientalist approach could be like, okay, look, understand the system, but then their whole thing is maybe there's a bias towards preserving their faith. And so therefore...
But do you see how, rationally speaking, how... Yeah, that is one of the accusations. Do you see how ridiculous the idea is that I'm going to fabricate, let's say, this book, but in the very beginning, I'm going to write a hadith that says whoever fabricates a lie against me is going to be in the hellfire.
But here's the thing that I find interesting is that the mindset of an Orientalist in the today context, these hadith scholars that then are applying the same methodology and strictness in their situation. They're, hey, I need to know who that dude is or dudette is.
Right.
I need to know whether or not these two people could have actually met or not.
Yeah.
I need to know whether or not there is conflicting testimonies here.
So here's what you're saying, and I agree with you. This shows more, sadly to say, it shows more about some of the preconceived notions that some of the Orientalists have. They already have the conclusion. This is not a prophet. These hadith are not preserved, so on and so on. How do I justify my belief? Some of them. So
it's not even scientific in the approach that where scientists might be like, you know what? Here's my hypothesis. I'm going to try to disprove myself.
No, it's not. It's not like that at all.
Okay.
It's more of an analysis of the system of hadith.
Okay.
And you hear the most common claim. This is what Qur'anists say because they fell into this trap of the Orientalists. They say hadith wasn't even compiled for another 200 or 300 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Okay. Which is
not true.
It's not factual at all. Yeah. Right? You have many books that were compiled before, and even
there's writing and compilations of different companions.
Right, and even those they were documented, recorded in some of these other books of hadith.
Okay.
Furthermore, who is it that compiled the Quran? It's companions. Do you trust the companions? They're like, yeah, they sacrificed their lives. That means they believe in it.
And not only that, for each verse, we have multiple witnesses to corroborate that this is verbatim as from Rasulullah from Jibreel.
Right, because it was memorized by the Ummah. And then these are the same people that preserved hadith. Who are you claiming transmitted the hadith otherwise?
Okay.
Right? If you're accusing them of lying, that means they don't really believe
So basically, if somebody within themselves is to reject hadith in of itself, despite all of the rigor and strictness that went into the compilation process, then one is essentially saying that Quran is not held up as well.
Well, they might not be saying that, but that should be the logical implication.
Yes.
Not just that. If somebody is going with this mentality of let's reject all of hadith because I don't believe that it was rigorously preserved, then you better not believe a single news claim that you ever hear, a single claim from a friend that you ever hear.
Right.
Because you're not testing anything.
Yeah.
Bilal said there's a fire outside. I'm going to run out. There's a fire outside.
Right.
Right. So we believe things without any check nowadays.
Even today's day and age with the whole idea with just
fake news
in general, right? I mean, I don't like calling it fake news because it's like, man, there's a wonderful book I think is everybody should read. It's called Trust Me, I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Manipulator.
Wow.
It's a fantastic book which actually goes into the process that people leverage to propagate false news. And it's a great awareness book.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, the person who wrote the book tried to use it as a means of warning people like, look, these are the methods that are used. Don't do this. Whereas many people have used that book as the template to do just that.
That's the manifesto.
Yeah.
Oh, man. SubhanAllah.
So
Bilal just gave all of you a manifesto.
Well, no, but here's the thing. In the short term, yes, you might win and get your false message out. But in the long term, your credibility is destroyed.
Right.
So, I mean, as you see, like people like what's it called? Gawker. Gawker paid such a huge lawsuit because of the fake news that they propagated on behalf of somebody like Hulk Hogan, right? They said whatever they said, and Hulk Hogan went to court. He didn't have the means, so Peter Thiel, this investor, he funded basically his legal campaign, and Gawker lost.
Wow.
And they I think I don't know if they actually went belly up but they were required to pay a huge sum of money for the defamation that they ended up doing. So, but like I said, false news is not. It's a big thing. At the same time, if you do it in the long term, you're going to lose.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, that's the thing. We see that in history, right? The scholars of hadith who used to interact with these fabricators and liars, they used to expose them, right? They're known. There's no hiding. When you narrate a hadith, you're putting yourself out there. You are going to go through the background check.
Yeah. And yeah, your sincerity and your credibility will, if it's good, it will withstand the test of time.
Absolutely.
And if not, then sayonara, sucker. With that, I think we'll end on that note. Basically, Suleiman Hani is going to be sharing his class. Basically, it's going to be on the subject of Sahih Muslim, and basically understanding how you can leverage the knowledge here for your own personal, spiritual, intellectual, and just personal growth through that, and as well as know, do we need hadith today? And if so, why? And how can we leverage that to the best of our success.
Inshallah.
All right, guys.
Looking forward to it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.